And hello, freshmen. Today we'll begin with our first video lecture for Unit 4, and we'll be on Lesson 1A notes. I've opened the Notability doc, and I encourage you to watch this video on one device and complete the notes on Notability in another device, or print the notes out and you could watch the video and complete the notes on paper at the same time. Today we'll be talking about the books of the latter prophets and also the major and minor prophets. There's different ways to talk about these books. We're going to start by talking about the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible, if you remember, the second part of it is called the Nevi'im, which means prophets in Hebrew. And there are two parts of the Nevi'im. There's the former prophets, and the former prophets are the earlier ones. There's also the later prophets, the latter prophets, which are the later ones. And there's 4 books in each of these sections. The former prophets, if you remember from last quarter, are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And the latter prophets also have 4 books. The 4 books of the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And as I mentioned in class on Monday, the 12 refer to the 12 minor prophets or smaller prophet books that are in the Old Testament. Let's look now at when these prophets lived and how these books are organized in different versions of the Old Testament. One important thing is to realize is that there's the overlap between the early prophets and the latter prophets happens in the second half of 2 Kings. It's during the second half of 2 Kings that the earlier prophets come to an end and the latter prophets begin. But the rest of these latter prophets actually continued on for hundreds of years after Kings. The history of Kings ended and the exile happened, and even after the exile. Again, this is why these prophets are called the latter prophets. It's because they happened later on. So these are the prophets after or later than the stories that we've read so far. Here's a table of the books of the prophet section, and there's a bunch of columns. I want to start by looking at the Hebrew Bible book. So if we look at the Hebrew Bible, it's the Bible in Hebrew, and again, there's 4 prophets under the former or earlier prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then there are 4 prophets under the latter prophets, the later ones: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12. And again, the 12 refers to these 12 smaller prophetic books: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. For our purposes, for this class, you do not need to memorize all 12. You can simply remember that there are 12. And remember Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. As we move to the other versions of the Bible, let's start with the Septuagint here. The Septuagint, recall, is the Greek version of the Old Testament. and it's abbreviated LXX. And we see that when they translated the Bible, they did change the orders, putting the 12 first: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then comes Isaiah and Jeremiah. There are some other books added: Baruch, Lamentations, the letter of Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel and Daniel. We'll talk about some of those books at another time. What I want to do today is focus on how Christian Bibles, both Protestant and Catholic, are structured. And in this case, the books are organized as major prophets and minor prophets. So there's the major prophets go first, and then the minor prophets are second. Let's first talk about what the difference is between a major prophet and a minor prophet. Major prophets have bigger books. That's simply it. They have more prophecies. And the minor prophets have smaller books. They have less prophecies. And there are 4 major prophets. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah. Let's go over that again. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And that's true in all Christian Bibles. There's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. You notice that there are other books mentioned: Lamentations and Baruch in the Catholic Bible. But those books actually are not prophetic books. But they're put there because traditionally Jeremiah is viewed as the author. So Lamentations is not a prophetic book, but it's next to Jeremiah because by tradition Jeremiah is the author. So not a prophetic book, but connected with Jeremiah. And that goes for the same thing in Catholic Bibles with Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah. We'll talk more about the Apocrypha and things in tomorrow's lecture. But for now, just know that the way the Christian Bible is organized, that books are put together with people and situations, even if they don't quite fit in perfectly. So there are 4 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And there are 12 minor prophets. And guess what? They are the same as the 12. And this is true in both Catholic and Protestant Bibles, that you have these 12 minor prophets. And in the Hebrew Bible, they're called the 12. In Christian Bibles, they're listed each individually: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So again, there are 4 major prophets with bigger books, and there are 12 minor prophets. If we look all the way over the left-hand column now, this left-hand column talks about the chronological order. The chronological order. Let's use... Sure, I'll use chronological means in order of time, when the prophets lived and spoke. That's what chronological is. So chronos, the Greek word for time. And I'm not going to go over all of the different time periods of the prophets, but there are a few that I want you to know about. The first time era has to do with these first 4 prophets. These were the prophets during the Assyrian period. If you remember, Assyria was the big bad guy for a while, and they came and conquered Israel and Judah, except for Jerusalem. And they were really rough and mean, and would skewer people and exile people, and they were rough. And God used these prophets to warn his people about what to do to avoid judgment and what to do when Assyria came. So these prophets are during the Assyrian period. And if we had more time, we could read some of their prophecies and connect it to some of the events we've talked about. But alas, we don't. The other group of prophets I want you to know about are these ones right here. Jeremiah, Obadiah, and Ezekiel. Those are the prophets during the Babylonian period. So if you remember, after Assyria became weak and were defeated, Babylon became the new superpower and eventually conquered Jerusalem. And God used Jeremiah, Obadiah, and Ezekiel to warn God's people of Babylon's conquests and to tell them what to do before Babylon came, and then also once Babylon came to conquer them. So Jeremiah, Obadiah, and Ezekiel are the three prophets God used during the Babylonian time, and Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah God used during the Assyrian time. And again, all these prophets from Amos to Ezekiel, all in this column, all lived in during the second half of 2 Kings, during the events we talked about in lesson 7 of the last unit. There's a lot of other notes and terms and other things. We're going to skip over that for now just to simplify things. And I'd like to wrap up today talking about some other differences between the former and the latter prophets. Again, on a basic level, former, hopefully by now you know, you don't even have to write it, means earlier. The latter one means later prophets. And besides being earlier and later, there are some other important changes. One important difference is that the former prophets mostly features stories of the prophets. And so we read about Elisha's miracles or Elisha's miracles or Elijah challenging the prophets of Baal and setting fire. We read about Joshua. We read about Samuel. And all these prophets, primarily what is in the former prophets are stories about them. But in the latter prophets, there aren't many stories. Instead, you have a lot of prophecies by the prophets. And so, for instance, in the book of Amos, there are almost no stories, this tiny little section. But instead, you read about the things that God said through Amos. And that is the same in all of the latter prophets, except for Jonah. There are almost no stories in those books, but rather lots of prophecies. A second important difference is that the former prophets is almost always prose, meaning paragraphs. And so you read the story or read their speech, and you move on from paragraph to paragraph. But in the latter prophets, there's actually a lot of poetry. Some of the prophets, like Ezekiel and Habakkuk, actually would use music and sing their prophecies. And so you can imagine people going out and trying to spread God's word through music, through poetry. And sometimes people would listen, and sometimes they rejected these prophets' message. But the poetry became a powerful way to communicate God's words. Interestingly, some of these songs are quite risque and controversial and would have, especially Ezekiel, an explicit lyric label on them if they were produced today. So don't picture these songs being all cheery. Many of them are announcing doom and telling Israel that it's been very sinful. The prophets like to compare Israel to a whore, a prostitute, and describe this country, this people, as being very risque and lewd in its actions with other countries. So picture very graphic songs of sexual immorality and then being described as a country cheating on God, its faithful husband. And there you have what some of these songs were like. So you can imagine they were quite jarring to people, as you'd have somebody respected as a prophet, but then say that God is telling them that they are a bunch of whores and that God is going to treat them awful in punishment. That's kind of what the gist is of some of these poems. I'm sorry we don't get to read more of them. The prophets, finally, a final difference. The prophets and the former prophets mainly speak to kings. If you remember, Nathan worked for King David. Samuel anointed Saul and David. Elijah and Elisha confronted Ahab and their family members. And so a lot of these prophets were mainly focused on trying to get the kings to do the right thing so that the country would go in the right direction. But in the latter prophets, the prophetic speeches are usually addressed to everyone, not just the kings, but all of the Israelites, whether in Israel or in Judah. And sometimes these prophets even gave prophecies to other countries. And so sections of Isaiah are to all the different countries around Judah. And sections of Amos also have prophecies for all the different regions and people groups that are non-Israelites. So those are some key differences between the former and the latter prophets. And as we wrap up this first lecture on the former and latter prophets, I want to talk about three major themes of the latter prophets. And again, I'm sorry we won't have time to read these amazing books. They're some of my favorite parts of the Old Testament, and it saddens me we're in this situation. But I hope that at some point, whether in church or on your own or in another class, you will take the time to study their great wealth of insight and be changed by God's Word. So what are the three major themes you'd encounter if you did read the latter prophets? Well, one is condemnation. Of sins against people. And the word for that is injustice. If you remember, one thing that God really, really cares about is justice, that people are treated equally and not being favored just because they're rich or important. But in Israel and Judah, that was not the case. If you remember from our last lesson, there were many times where the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer, and things were not fair. People did not have an equal chance to seek God, an equal chance to feed their families, an equal chance to live. And so many of the prophets are really condemning this type of sin, and God uses them to remind his people that he loves everyone and made everyone for a purpose, and that the poor should not be trampled on. Another major theme in the prophets is condemnation of sins against God. And we could call this false worship. And so if you remember, in Israel, there were those shrines in Dan and Bethel, and those golden calves and the non-Levite priests. And so you have Hosea has a powerful message against Beth Aven. And Beth Aven is not a real place. You never find it in a map. And he uses that term because Beth El means house of El, or house of God. And for him, it was not God's house. For God, it was not his house. And so instead he calls it the house of sin, or house of evil, house of wickedness, Beth Aven. And so, again, these prophets were often very creative, and God did not just deliver these redundant prophecies, but rather they used different means, whether poetry, or whether clever terms, whether risque lyrics, to try to get people to realize their sins. So a lot of the prophets, especially the ones that I mentioned in the Assyrian and Babylonian period, they have long sections of condemnations. There are a lot of problems in Israel before it falls to Assyria, and in Judah before it falls to Babylon. But these prophetic books also have at least one chapter, and some of them have several chapters of hope. And so the third major theme is hope that God will save or restore his people. And so the prophets are really sad books. They get really disturbingly ugly sometimes, and the sin that's going to happen, and the that's been happening, and the punishment that will happen. But they also have great messages of hope. And sometimes the message of hope is salvation, that God will keep the people safe, and they'll avoid the suffering. But sometimes the message is that the suffering is going to happen because they've been sinning so much. But even though they're going to suffer for some time, things will get better after the punishment ends. And so there'll be an end to the exile. There'll be an end to the scattering of the Israelite tribes. There'll be an end to all these wars and famine and plagues and everything else that's happening as a result of Israel's and Judah's sin. And so that summarizes what's going on in the former and the latter prophets and how these books are organized. And I'd like you now, having finished your notes for 1A, to use those notes and to complete the items on the Lesson 1 study guide related to 1A. And if there are certain items that you're stuck on or not sure about, I'm happy to go over those with you during our virtual class at 2:30. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please email me.